Good day, guys, and welcome to one of our emergency rants with seminars. You only had, I think, two of these things, or was it one? I remember the COVID one, which is obviously the big one that we had when we first moved into the GSC several years ago, and that I think was rather, helpful. So in this seminar, just to give an idea of what we're going to be doing, we are not going to be talking about, the political stuff and the ethical stuff and that kind of thing. We're just looking at what the participants are in this particular conflict, who can be drawn into it and who cannot be drawn into it, etc., and what impact it might have on investments. And so we're looking from that angle here. I don't have the knowledge, the experience in the section to talk about any other kind of aspect besides the financial aspect. So that's just a way I'm going to be approaching this, okay? Now, what I want you to understand is you need to look at this picture here. This is the map of the region. You can't even see, Israel and Palestine on this thing. Okay, it's the place, little gap you see right between Egypt, Syria, that little strip there. That is basically Israel and Gaza. Not even on that map, but you can see that it's been surrounded by a number of very large countries, very important countries of the global, economy, especially countries that you associate a lot with oil: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Oman, the UAE is on this thing as well. Also countries that have had quite a history with instability: Yemen, Ethiopia, Sudan, recently Egypt, Pakistan, Afghanistan, all here as well. So yeah, it is a rather volatile region of the world. But obviously not all these different countries are playing a role here. Not all the countries that are playing a role are on this particular map. So what we're going to start off with is just giving you a list of countries or a list of participants, I think, that might be, involved in any kind of ongoing conflict here. This is other than the Israelis and the Palestinians. So other than Israel and the Palestinians, these are the main people that might play a part in this particular conflict and might be drawn in various ways, okay? So the first one I'm going to talk about is the US. The US has a very strong pro-Israel establishment. And why I say pro-Israel establishment is because over the last little while, you've seen that to a certain extent diminish. It also has a significant grassroots element that's also pro-Israel, which is the evangelical movement. For those that may not know, if you lived under a rock for the last couple millennia, Israel is often called the Holy Land, and there's many religions that have many holy sites and historical links to the region. And the evangelical movement in the US, for those reasons, is very pro-Israel. But there's a growing pro-Palestinian grassroots movement as well. And to some extent, it's actually growing into some of the establishment stuff. And that part of that is based on immigration. Of course, there's a number of places in the US where a large number of Muslim immigrants have gone into. But also, things like the Black Lives Movement, etc. The new diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, it tends to be more pro-Palestine than it would be pro-Israel, for instance. And therefore, you've seen, for instance, statements from places like Harvard, etc., supporting Palestine. Now, the thing with the US as well is that obviously it has huge military, assets in the area. And so you are seeing, for instance, almost immediately after the attack occurred, this is, of course, the attack by Hamas on Israel, a few days ago, they moved an aircraft carrier into the region. The exact reason for this, they say basically to prevent outside parties from getting involved, but it is basically to back up Israel. The EU, European Union, historically, it has been more pro-Palestine than the US. You find much more, in the US, for instance, nobody is pro-Palestine except for a small number of people. Even people that basically have, we would think would not be having a dog in the fight, have come out with extremely pro-Palestine, pro-Israeli statements on both sides of the aisle, both the Democratic and the Republican side of the aisle. For instance, an example I'll give here is that many politicians that have been rather ambivalent about supporting Ukraine against Russia, like Ron DeSantis, etc., have come out with extremely positive, statements in support of Israel. However, in the EU, historically, you have found much more sympathy for the Palestinians. You find many more left-wing politicians. You have found many more, sorry, many more establishment politicians taking a more pro-Palestinian, approach to things. More on the left than on the right, most certainly, but it generally is more pro-Palestinian than the US. Not to say it's pro-Palestinian, but just more than the US. However, since the attack, it's been almost exclusively pro-Israeli rhetoric. You've seen, for instance, Germany putting up an Israeli flag. I think the parliament, I think you've seen a similar kind of move from places like the UK, etc. And historically, because of their pro-Palestinian approach, the EU has been a huge source of funding for the Palestinians, and that has been cut. So that has a huge impact on the region. I'm going to pronounce this badly. Forgive me. I grew up saying the word Turkey, but Turkey is the new word for Turkey, a name for Turkey. Historically, because co-religionists have been more pro-Palestine. They are a NATO member, which is important. They've had conflicts with Israel. In fact, there was I think a actual attack on some Turkish ships by Israel when they tried to basically break the embargo on Gaza and bring stuff to Gaza. Some people died, in fact, in that. And they also have conflicts with Israel around, maritime resources, especially, I think, natural gas around Israel, etc. And that has been, obviously a source of tensions. Turkey is also a big player here because it's also key to some other participants, in this particular conflict, or potential participants in the conflict. It's key to, for instance, Russia sanctions. A lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about here has to do with trade routes, etc. And one of the things that Turkey does is controls a key trade route for both Russia and Ukraine, and have been able to basically allow, for instance, Ukrainians to export some of their grain, preventing the Russians from basically blockading them, etc. And also the thing about Turkey at the moment is that it has some significant economic difficulty. The currency has weakened dramatically over the last 6-7 years or so. To give you an idea how bad we're talking about, we're looking at like a 600% weakening from 2015 till now. That would be like the rand from now till, say, 2029, going from, say, 19 to 20 to maybe 120. That's the kind of move we've seen in Turkey. So that is obviously weakened some of their potential, ability to intervene in these things. Next, Saudi Arabia. Historically, for obvious reasons, very pro-Palestine. However, recently it has warmed up relations to Israel. In fact, this is a possible motivation for the attack. There is a strong argument to be made that the reason that the attack occurred at this particular point in time, also beyond just this being an important anniversary and also falling on a Israeli holiday, but also because it was meant to derail the growing relations between the Saudis and the Israelis. The Saudi Arabians have been, like I said, pro-Palestinian in the past to such an extent that, you've seen, for instance, difficulties for those that have Israeli stamps in their passports going to some of these countries. Okay, but the reason that they've been warming is because Saudi Arabia has a bigger enemy in that region than the Israelis, and that's Iran. And it has been trying to do something about Iran for a while. Trying to push the US, for instance, to be more aggressive towards Iran. And the Israelis share that kind of motivation. And so that's the basis of that particular alliance. Also there's other reasons as well, but I think one of the big bases is that they are anti-Iranian, both of them. But since the attack, I think it's pretty clear that the warming relations have at the very least been put on hold and may have been scuppered for the indefinite future. And I think the notice about Saudi Arabia is it's pretty much dependent on the US. Without the US supporting them, they cannot survive in that region, especially the royal family. The US pretty much is a guarantee of the royal family succession, stability in that region, has bases around Saudi Arabia as well as other countries as well in the area, and provides effectively security. Next, Iran. Iran is kind of the invisible force here. It's pro-Palestinian, like most Muslim countries are. It's also very anti-US and anti-Israel, but also anti-Saudi. It has links with Hezbollah and Hamas, and also has had a nuclear deal that's been on the cards for, or been basically in limbo for a long time. What you must understand is that the Saudi-Iranian, conflict has been a significant conflict, and Iran has been a major player in the region forever. It is a major player even in, for instance, in Iraq right now, because of the moves that the Americans have done to like depose, Saddam Hussein all the way back in the Second Gulf War. And the anti-US, anti-Iranian sentiment goes back all the way to the deposition of, or basically the assassination, removal, the coup of, I think, one of the first, or if not the first, democratically elected, leader of Iran. This was back in the 1950s, I believe. And this has been a long-term, issue between the countries. And because of the US's link to Israel, as well as for other reasons, it's been pretty much anti-Israeli since its formation. The nuclear deal, why this is important, is because the nuclear deal was meant to basically take away Iran's ability to create a nuclear weapon, which was meant to basically give them, also a re-entry into the global economy. For those that don't know, US sanctions on Iran have really crippled that economy. But despite that, they've been making remarkable progress towards some kind of nuclear bomb of some kind. They claim it's not for weaponry, but it's pretty clear it is for weaponry. At the moment, there's only one nuclear power in the region, that's Israel. If Iran gets a nuclear bomb, expect the Saudis to look at one as well. Expect Turkey to think about it as well. It becomes a much more complicated issue. Of course, Turkey with NATO doesn't really need it because it has the NATO support, but you know what I mean in terms of like the kind of pressure in terms of nuclear proliferation in the region. Russia is pretty pro-Palestinian, has been for a long time. Like I said, the US is pro-Israeli. Russia, as a descendant of the Soviet Union, has historically taken the other side of most conflicts, and so they've been more pro-Palestinian. But it's complicated. The reason it's complicated at the moment is because there's a rather large number of Russians in Israel. But 1 in 7 Israelis are basically Russian speakers, native Russian speakers. What's happened is since the end of the Cold War, Israel has been accepting Russian Jews, people that say that they're Jewish from Russia. Because Israel is a richer country than Russia, a lot of people have moved across saying that they are Jewish. Maybe they are, maybe they are not. Maybe there's some historical links there, but enough of them have moved across that they form about 1/7 of the population. 15% of the population of Israel is basically of Russian descent. And for this reason, I think Israel has been relatively neutral in the Russia-Ukraine war. Of course, it's taken the Ukrainian side, but it's not been anywhere as vociferously pro-Ukrainian as, for instance, the French or the Germans or the UK has been. It's been much more just lukewarm on it. Though, like I said, it's more pro-Ukrainian than pro-Russian, of course. And also, the Russians have had a strong link and growing link with the Iranians. The Iranians have supplied them with weaponry for the war. Apparently, some of the drones that they've been using in the war have come from Iran. So that's a growing link between those countries. And beyond these particular participants, there's also some others that we need to talk about. China, India, Egypt, Lebanon. Oh, so I put China in there twice. Apologies for that. Egypt, Syria, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Sorry for the China repeat there. Basically, it's we did this quite late. Only decided to do it yesterday, so therefore we haven't had a good chance to go through the whole thing and have it proofread. But so let's look at China and start there. China gets a huge chunk. We'll talk about it in a minute about its its oil, etc. from this particular part of the world. But beyond that, we'll talk about the oil stuff in a bit. But beyond that, China has its own issues with Islamic fundamentalism. There is a group in China called the Uyghurs, spelled UI, Uyghurs. And they basically are a Muslim group in China that has been effectively, kind of censured by the Chinese government. There has been, significant evidence that we've seen of some really, let's say, extreme practices put against them. Like, a significant part of the population is in re-education camps. things like that sound like almost unbelievable. Like, for instance, if you're a significant Uyghur that's in a camp, the Chinese government may have a bureaucrat, a Chinese loyalist, go and stay in your house with your family, that kind of stuff. And the Chinese have had, obviously, to kind of negotiate a very difficult line, I would say, around this. They're very dependent on oil, for instance, from this particular region of the world, the Middle East. They have strong alliances with countries like, for instance, Pakistan, for reasons like the antagonism with India. And so obviously this makes it difficult for them to have such an anti-Muslim, policy in place. They've somehow managed to basically keep this under the wraps, and so they're basically are kind of treading on eggshells here if they do intervene too extremely. India as well has played a part here. If you go online, you find a lot of support for Israel from India. India has become a very, very strong support of Israel. In fact, Prime Minister Modi came out, Prime Minister Modi of India has come out, one of the first people, before I think even Joe Biden came out, with a message on Twitter or X, whatever you call it nowadays, in support of Israel. You find that there's a significant support among the BJP for Israel, and this is again to do with the own internal politics. The BJP tends to be more anti-Muslim. There's obviously antagonism towards the major enemy, as they view it, is Pakistan, which is a Muslim country, and so India has taken a significant pro-Israeli move, though historically they've been much more pro-Palestinian, and so they have moved more pro-Israeli in recent times. Egypt, though Egypt shares a border with Israel and Gaza, it's to a certain extent, out of this particular thing. Anwar Sadat, way back in the day, was one of the first countries to make a deal with the Israelis in terms of having, friendly relationship. He was assassinated, by the way, for that particular, deal. But Egypt has kind of like stepped away. They don't do much. They blocked, for instance, Palestinians from moving between Gaza and Egypt, etc. They've they don't step into the breach much in terms of any kind of disagreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. That being said, there was a attack by an Egyptian on a couple Israelis, tourists in Egypt. Just after the attack this weekend, which does indicate that there's some public sentiment that's going one direction, but the official thing in Egypt is basically stay away. Like I said, even though they do share a border, the other border that Israel has that's quite troublesome is Lebanon. Lebanon houses Hezbollah, and they've historically been a thorn in the side. In fact, Israel has invaded a couple of times into Lebanon to basically try and quell Hezbollah. As yet, we don't know if Hezbollah has any intention to really join in the conflict. They may, but right now they have not really been any kind of major movements there. Next, Syria. Syria, as you know, has gone through a civil war. In that civil war, a big player has been Turkey and as well, Russia, because they have such internal issues. They've kind of ignore the outside world, but it could play a part in here. And the reason I would say that I would include it on the list is because it does show that some of these events, for instance, what caused Syria to collapse was not something internal to Syria. It was the Iraqi war. Which took out Saddam Hussein and created, it was ISIS, which basically helped to destabilize Syria. And I include another couple countries here, Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, for those that don't know, there's been almost a bloodless war between these two countries. There was some blood, but not as much as you would think, very recently. And Azerbaijan basically took a big chunk of Armenia out. There was initially a conflict after the breakup of the Soviet Union, where Armenia basically took a piece of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is going after those pieces more recently. It's a much larger country. It's a much wealthier country. It's a much, stronger military. And they've used the fall of Russia in terms of global standing to go after Armenia. Armenia had been protected by the Russians, and the Azerbaijanis were unable to do much until the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which meant that Russia was unable to support Armenia, and the Azerbaijanis took advantage of this, and they basically moved in. Now, why did I put this up there as well? Because this is more and more, other countries that are involved in some way and are going to be affected in some fundamental ways by whatever happens in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, some alliances here. So the first thing to talk about is NATO, obviously the big North American treaty organization. The US, EU, and Turkey are part of that. NATO is pretty clearly pro-Israeli at the moment, even though they include, Turkey. But primarily, they also are anti-Russian and anti-Iranian as well. They've had huge, conflicts with Russia because, of course, Russia. One of the reasons Russia, in fact, invaded Ukraine was to prevent the expansion of NATO. And so Russia has been anti-NATO, NATO has been anti-Russia. In fact, NATO was created to fight Russia. They've also been anti-Iranian, driven by the US. And so, therefore, this particular alliance is important in this region because obviously it's the most powerful military alliance in the world, and is able to basically step in and do things that other alliances just cannot do. Next is Brics. Brics used to stand for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But since then, or since the last meeting, it's added a bunch of new members. And members that are, important for this particular discussion are places like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. So these are the new additions to Brics that are part of it. Obviously, other places like Argentina have also been added, but this is what you want to be focusing on. So in terms of the Brics countries that are really related to this particular thing, it's China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, and the UAE, maybe even India, if you want to put that in there as well. Now, historically, Brics has been semi-neutral to pro-Palestinian. And if you look at the makeup of these countries here, they tend to be the pro-Palestinian, whatever. But like I said, there has been moves recently. Like India, for instance, has moved significantly more pro-Israel than they were in the past. Not to say that they are as pro-Israeli, for instance, as the Americans are, or even as the Europeans are. But they are certainly more pro-Israeli than they were, say, 10, 20 years ago. I do think that Brics, because of a number of different reasons, might be involved in this for some way, but they are such varied countries. It's difficult for them to have a coordinated policy between them, even though on the face of it, this is probably the largest group of countries in the world in terms of economies, in terms of populations, in terms of even military might. And then the antis. Who's anti what? There's the anti-Iranian wing, which is things like, for instance, Saudi Arabia and Israel and the US and the EU. Even though the Saudis may not be, totally friends with the Israelis, they're anti-Iranian. There's the anti-Russian wing, for instance, the EU and the US, anti-Russia. And then there's anti-US. For instance, Iran is anti-US. Russia is anti-US. China, to a certain extent, is also anti-US. You might even bring things, for instance, like Saudi Arabia, like North Korea into this mix as well. It's still being anti-US. And what happens in these particular wars, that's often the danger that we need to talk about, is that they turn out to be from being a war between these two particular participants, Israel and Palestine, into a war between parties that are using this conflict as a proxy to fight their own things. For instance, you've seen already statements from the US, not talking about from crackpots. I'm talking about, maybe they are crackpots, but from politicians, from senators, in the US calling for an attack on Russia or an attack on Iran, to basically punish them for their support of the attack. You've seen, for instance, moves by certain parties out there to try and distance the Israelis from the Russians, for instance. Moves to, for instance, warn Hezbollah that there'll be attacks on Iran if moves are made. And the danger here is that if you have these linkages in terms of alliances, what could happen, as for instance happened in World War I and World War II, for instance, is that one conflict drags in other members who are entering for their own particular reasons, and it kind of blows up to something larger than the initial issue. In World War One, you had the assassination of a small noble, in the middle of Eastern Europe, that caused places like the UK and the US to go to war with Germany. In World War II, attack by Japan on the US caused the US to attack Germany. That kind of stuff can easily happen in these conflicts, and so you must be aware of what the linkages are between the different parties. Okay, now here is where I think the important feature is, at least in the short term, and that's oil. Again, looking at this map here, you can see that there's a little kind of thing between Iran and Oman. Okay, a little kind of like a little kind of narrowing. That's called the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, it is a key thing in the global economy, much more important than you would think. If you've never heard about it before, it's like one of the veins in your body. You may not know what it is there, but you cut that thing out and you die in like a few minutes. The same thing here. The Straits of Hormuz is an incredibly key area in the global economy, and we'll talk about it in right now. Okay, so oil prices have risen slightly since we've had the conflict start. It's only been a couple of days, but prices have gone up like 2-3%. I think it went from 85 to 88 for Brent crude, or 89, sorry, Brent crude. 88, 89. So it's talking about like a 3-4% increase. It's come back down. It's about 87.5 or so at the moment. And this has been due to tensions. There's been no actual change in supply and demand out there. Supply and demand has basically stayed the same, but there's been increasing tensions, and so people want to get more oil, and therefore the oil price goes up slightly because of that. Tensions are not a long-term way to get the oil price up, and they don't have a long-term impact on prices or the economy. Supply and demand changes, however, do have a significant impact on prices and the economy. And that's where the Straits of Hormuz come into play. Like I said, the Straits of Hormuz are like a key artery for the global economic system, more important than you would think. 90%, or almost 90%, like 88 or 87% of Gulf oil and natural gas goes through this particular strait. And that means a third of natural gas and a fifth of oil in the entire world goes through this strait. So a third of the world's natural gas and a fifth of the world's oil is going through this little bit of land, a little bit of sea up here. You can see it right here between Iran and Oman, that little kind of thing here. A third of the world's natural gas and a fifth of the world's oil goes through that. And you can easily imagine, stopping that happen. If you think about it, what's an oil tanker? It's not a tank. It's a big balloon, a metal balloon of oil. It's incredibly easy for even a small amount of weaponry to destroy that, make an area untravelable for these oil tankers, untravelable for the transport of natural gas, etc. Very, very easy. These things are naturally flammable. You think about it. Set a small bomb up, get the oil burning, that ship is gone, and that ship basically is full of so much oil it could pollute the area for decades to come. It could cause huge amounts of devastation around there, and also the amount of damage, economic damage it does, would mean that other people willing to ship stuff through that region may not be willing to ship stuff anymore because of the losses there. And China and India are huge players in this particular thing. Let's look at China. In 2021, that's about a couple of years ago, and so also like in COVID times, China was basically buying $128 billion of oil purchases from countries basically around the Straits of Hormuz. $128 billion. Okay, that's about 45% of their total was coming from this region. India is even worse. India has basically 2/3 of its oil and about half its liquefied natural gas coming via the Straits of Hormuz. If you went out and you basically shut that area down, you'd take out China and India's economies almost overnight. Okay, it would be like what happened with Europe, but much, much worse. Okay, we're talking about the two largest populated countries in the world. We're talking about, China, for instance, which is the world's manufacturer, the number one or number two largest economy in the world if you look in the purchasing power parity. And if they lose 45% of their energy from, oil and gas, virtually overnight, that will impact that economy extremely badly. But the reason I say this will be worse than what happened to Europe, because Europe is very, very rich. China is also quite rich, but not quite as rich as Europe. And Europe was able to go out and get supplies elsewhere in the world. But India, for instance, would not be able to do that quite as easily. India would probably have to rely more on what's coming out of Russia at the moment, which might mean that Russia would have more of a leverage there. At the moment, the Russians have a sanction put on them by the EU and the US, which prevents them from exporting oil at more than $60 a barrel. That is the limit. No country can basically take Russian oil at more than $60 a barrel, or they'd face sanctions from the US and Europe. However, if India was to lose 2/3 of its oil and half its natural gas, because they couldn't transport it versus the Straits of Suez, they'd be paying $70, $80 a barrel towards the Russian natural gas, no problem. The same thing with the Chinese. They would be much more willing to basically, break any kind of sanction with the Russians in order to basically obtain their oil and gas needs. And other markets, okay? We must understand that Gulf oil feeds Asia mostly. The real danger in terms of oil, in terms of natural gas, is going to be to the Asian markets. That being said, there has been some, disruption to Israeli gas fields as well, which are more in the Mediterranean and which obviously would be more useful for places like Europe. But primarily, if you're looking at a disruption in the energy flow here, it would be for Asia. It would be for places like India, China, South Korea, and those kind of places. It would be very positive, I think, for Russia. If India, like I said, loses more than half its natural gas, if China loses half its oil from that it needs that comes from that region, it makes Russia's hand as an oil exporter extremely strong. That will also affect global manufacturing and global trade. We have an integrated world. You saw what happened after COVID when we had small disruptions in containers and whatever, and shipping prices and so on between the parts of the world, and the amount of inflation that caused. However, that is pale into insignificance if something like, for instance, the Straits of Suez were closed for a few months. And like I said, it's incredibly easy for someone to do that. Mine that area, small rockets, drones, a $10,000 drone could inflict billions in terms of damage by attacking an oil tanker. Okay, the asymmetry in that particular warfare is incredibly strong, and so I think that if it does spread out, this particular conflict, you could easily be seeing that particular region of the world under attack. Trade, like I mentioned, affected. Also economic growth. Global economic growth, I think the largest contributor this year is probably going to be India, growing at over 8%. China's been a huge blower, 5% for this thing. Faster growing, so India at 8%, China at about 5%, significantly faster than places like the US and Europe, and also a significant contributor to total economic growth. You cut their energy consumption or the energy, access by that much, that growth disappears. And next we talk about the risk premiums. If we do have something like this happen, expect bond yields to rise. Bond yields are, obviously the amount that borrowers give to lenders to basically borrow the money. If uncertainty is higher, lenders will demand higher yields. That's called a risk premium. And I think that if we do see this happen, it may not be true for the US, it may not be quite as true for Europe, but you'll find in much of the emerging markets that the risk premium for their bonds would rise dramatically. And that would be quite a significant impact as well. Historically, when bond yields are quite high, it's incredibly bad for emerging markets. That's one of the reasons we had things like famines in Ethiopia in the 1980s, beyond, of course, the conflict there. It was because bond yields were high, because inflation was high, and that was basically, hurting those places. Okay. So that's it. That's my little roundup of this kind of situation. I didn't go into detail, like I said, on the conflict, but I want you to be aware of where your exposure might be. Strangely enough, a lot of it is in India, a lot of it is in China. Okay, because of their vulnerability to oil flows from that region. Places like Egypt, places like Lebanon, etc., might have a big impact immediately, but they really don't play a big part in the global economy, and definitely probably not in your own personal investment portfolio. But you disrupt oil and energy to India and China, and it will make an impact in your portfolio. Okay, so that is it for now. Do you have any questions? Or anyone wants to ask a question about what we discussed here? We can type it into Q&A or type into the chat. And, like I said, any question about what we discussed, I'm not going to be talking about the politics. I'm just going to talk about like markets and more likely who's going to be impacted, etc. Because the question about who might benefit from this. Look, I mean, if there is a disruption there, you'd probably be finding, places that don't have exposure to the region, oil producers benefiting. Venezuela, Nigeria would be countries that benefit. Mexico as well. You'd also probably find the kind of movements we've seen recently with regards to moving manufacturing out of China accelerate. Currently, it's accelerating because of, or it's moving forward because people feel that China is untrustworthy, but it will also accelerate because people might believe that China won't be able to produce in the future. How will this impact gold? Well, this is a bit weird because gold has two demands here. Gold has a fear demand and gold has a love demand. What do I mean by that? There's a love demand for jewelry, for having gold as a decoration, etc. And the places in the world that really love gold are actually China and India. Huge demand. Huge demand in terms of natural resources. Of gold, basically, from those two places. If we do have this happen, it's going to affect those two countries the worst, China and India, in terms of the large global economy. The fear trade is around inflation. It's around uncertainty. I think what you can say is that if China and India are out of the market, it takes away the floor to gold, because if gold falls below a certain price, the Chinese, the Indians, they step in and they buy gold. But the ceiling still remains in terms of like what's going to be happening with inflation, what's going to be happening, etc. around the need for a safe haven. Unfortunately, I think at the moment, if you look at what gold's looking at right now, even when we had COVID, even when we had global uncertainty, gold has not really stepped up. So I think it's going to be more negative for gold if there is something like this happening, because we take away that love trade where people buy for jewelry, and yet we still have the fear trade not really taking up that slack. Okay. The question is, why has the Aussie increased so much today, seeing that there is so much geopolitical risks? Well, the Aussie and a lot of global markets have come down. The market really hasn't responded as much as you might think, because nobody of the big participants has really been affected yet. Right now, it's entirely Israel, Palestine, neither of which are a major player. I mean, Israel is a bigger player in terms of like the global economy. Palestine is almost non-existent. And so that hasn't affected things. People will be changing their views should Iran and Saudi Arabia be drawn into this. Should we see something be done about Iran and something be done about the Strait of Suez? This is not, by the way, a guarantee. I'm not going to say this is going to happen, but I'm saying that right now you're seeing increased tensions, increased moves to basically look at the Iranians as a potential source for the attack. And should, for instance, either the Israelis or more likely the US attack, what that's going to do is it's going to turn into a case where if the Iranians feel like it, they will start mining that strait, or they will start using drones, and that could be really negative. It would be a last-ditch effort because firstly they're cut off their own source of funding, but also it would make significant enemies out of India and China who don't want this to happen. Okay. Now, next one, what portfolio changes do you suggest? I've been arguing this for a while now. I'm not a fan of China because of their demographics. For those who don't know, the Chinese working age population peaked basically 10 years almost ago. 2015, 2013, around that region was when we had the peak population of workers in China. Since then, it's been declining. The demographics are not attractive. Secondly, you've seen moves by the Chinese government to really crack down on any kind of dissidents, any kind of people that might have too much power here. What that has done is effectively meant a crackdown on the tech sector. People like Jack Ma, etc., have been negatively affected, and I think that means the Chinese economy right now is quite a bad situation. India is a bit more positive. Growth rates are rising and growing fast. Modi has been quite positive for economic growth, if not for other things. But again, that's not an economy that you want to be investing too much in. They have historically a great deal of uncertainty. For instance, there's a thing called demonetization, where one day the government got up and said, hey, all these particular notes are no longer going to be valid in like a certain period of time. All your bank notes out of a certain denomination will be valid. Go get some new ones. That is something they can pull off in like no time. Causes great deal of uncertainty. They've had huge issues with regards to fluctuations in policy, etc. It's not really a great thing. The place to invest, even without this particular thing happening, is the US. I've always been arguing, or at least for the last couple of years, been arguing that the US remains the most attractive place in the world to invest, and you want to be putting your money in there. Okay, so even without this, but if this does happen, it makes the US even more attractive. And why? The US, unlike almost any other large economy in the world, really doesn't need anybody else. They don't need global trade. They don't need food or natural resources from other parts of the world to a large extent. They are so large and they're so, generously endowed with natural resources. They can get by with their own food, their own energy, which almost nobody else in the world can do. The Europeans can't do it. The Chinese can't do it. The Indians can't do it. Nobody else can do that basically, but the US can. The US also has, a great deal of separation in terms of its vulnerability to any kind of conflict because of its oceans, because of its geography, etc., and as well as because of its very powerful military. And also, there's other reasons as well. For instance, the AI revolution is happening in Europe, the US, not happening anywhere else in the world, except maybe China. And China, like I said, because of the tech crackdown, I don't think they're going to be able to catch up with the US. So the US, if you want to look at where you want to be investing in this kind of scenario, it's the US. Okay, anybody else? Any questions about this particularly? Okay. How will this affect the dollar weaker? Never. The weird thing is that, EJ, is that the dollar does not weaken in crisis, it gets stronger. When the US was attacked in 9/11, okay, when their World Trade Center was destroyed because of an attack, when 3,000 plus Americans died because of it, the dollar got stronger. The dollar is the de facto safe haven in the world. If there's more crises in the world, the dollar will get stronger. It will not weaken the dollar. So if you're thinking that more crisis, weaker dollar, not a question. Always, if there's a crisis, irrespective of where in the world it is, no matter what it is, it's going to strengthen the dollar. Okay. Anyone else? I have a few minutes more if you want. Okay, let me just wrap it up then. So when it comes to this particular situation, like I said, there's obviously significant humanitarian and other concerns here which we have not touched. Obviously we all hope for peace and that kind of stuff, but understand that this particular kind of thing can sometimes really cause huge problems. We've seen historically, when you have this many different alliances, this many different participants, you can obviously create a situation in which things get out of control of any particular party. And here, if it does get out of control, there's a huge vulnerability. There is a particular piece of sea that is incredibly important to the global economy. Like I said, a third of natural gas, a fifth of oil, half of China's natural gas and oil, more than half of India's natural gas and oil. Asia basically depends on that big bit of water. It gets disrupted, the impacts are going to be immediate and strong. And like I said, in terms of the ability of a party to disrupt that, incredibly easy. A few drones, a few tens of thousands of dollars can do that. And before you think to yourself, how you're talking about drones, etc., know that just about a few months ago, there was a major attack against the refinery in Saudi Arabia by drones that were probably from Iran. Okay, and it caused significant damage. And if you look at some of the statements I've been talking about US politicians talking about Iran, one of them mentioned the fact that there's 4 major refineries in Iran. And if they were attacked, well, it would pretty much disable the Iranian economy. In that scenario, expect the Iranians to shut down that Strait of Suez. It just will be happening. And if that happens, like I said, the impact to the global economy could be quite dramatic. Okay, That's it. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, viv@randsmith.com, and I'll answer them separately. But like I said, focus on the financial stuff. Okay. Cheers. Thanks for coming through, guys.